Okay, everybody, let's take our seats. We're really pleased to have you all here today. I know quite a few of us have been anticipating this talk for a while because Stephanie was scheduled to do it at, I think, the end of 2025, right? So anyway, we got a bonus by her waiting because Daniel Werwath is here with us also, and so we're looking forward to their talk. And the forum is entitled, Who Killed Affordable Housing? A Murder Mystery Investigation. So I hope you're sitting at the edge of your chairs. So during this forum, journalist Stephanie Nakhleh and housing policy expert Daniel Werwath will explore the complex factors behind America's affordable housing crisis. They will examine both national trends and the local challenges in northern New Mexico. So drawing on their combined experience, which is quite impressive, they're going to talk about housing policy, zoning reform, development projects. Werwath and Nakhleh will investigate the root causes of housing unaffordability. They will discuss practical solutions for creating more livable communities. This presentation will combine both the policy analysis with real-world case studies, offering insights into how communities can move beyond scarcity thinking to build housing that serves residents of all different incomes. Sounds pretty ambitious. Hope it works. So Stephanie is an independent journalist with 30 years of experience covering northern New Mexico, a former reporter for the Los Alamos Monitor and the Santa Fe New Mexican. She now publishes a We Can Have Nice Things Substack focused on solutions-oriented journalism about housing, transportation, and public policy. And I want to put a personal aside in here. So about a month ago, Stephanie and I arranged to meet, and we didn't know each other. Tyler had set this up originally. And it turns out that we talked a little bit about what was going to go on in the forum, but she grew up on the street right next to where I live. She is about the same age as my daughter, and she was a very good friend of Lara Dunn, Skip and Hetty's kid. So it's a small world. So Daniel, excuse me, I said we should have mints, and now mine's interrupting my talking. Daniel is a housing policy and community development leader with extensive experience addressing housing affordability and homelessness in New Mexico and the Mountain West. He most recently served as senior housing policy advisor to Governor Michelle Lujan Grisham. That's pretty impressive. He has led several housing organizations, including the New Mexico Interfaith Community Housing Development Corporation, the Santa Fe Community Housing Trust, and Tierra Contenta Corporation. Daniel has advised local governments across the region on affordable housing policy and implementation. So we are really delighted to welcome them both. Let's have a warm welcome for Stephanie and Daniel. Come on up. And I'll see if I can get off the stage safely.
Please do. All right, hello everyone. I'm borrowing Anita Barella's glasses. Thank you, Anita. So big shout out to her because apparently I can't see the slides.
So is that working now?
Yeah, can everyone hear me okay? Okay. I was going to start with introducing ourselves, but I didn't, Earl Marie did such a great job. I don't really think we need to do that. So what I'd like to actually launch into is the definition of affordable housing, because what does that mean, right? Everybody has a different definition in their head of what that means. A lot of people think it means public housing or subsidized housing, but almost everybody in America actually lives in just regular, what we would call market rate housing, and that's what really has become so unaffordable over the last period of time that we'll get into. So that's really what the focus is on today. Who killed that housing affordability that used to be around a couple decades ago? All right. So first we're going to start off with the crime scene. And Daniel, do you want to get into?
Absolutely.
All right.
Let's see. How's this mic doing? Can everyone hear me okay? What? For those of you, I'm guessing just judging by the age levels we have in here that most folks probably haven't bought a house real recently. But for those that have had, they might have been a little shocked, right? Housing prices have gone up precipitously in the last 15 years, and especially in the last 66 or so years since the pandemic. And statewide, New Mexico is actually losing affordability faster than a lot of states. We've seen rents go up 60%, home prices go up 70%, and most alarmingly, we've seen nearly a doubling in the median cost of a new home. And so the cost to build and sell a new home is even higher than some of those. Now, some of these numbers, Los Alamos is a great example of where you're not adding a lot of housing and you've got a high demand for housing from high wage people. And so here you've seen sales prices go up 70% when incomes only rose about 20%. And that's that divergence of housing cost and income that is really the core of a housing affordability issue, right? Affordability is a function of income. And so as those get farther away from each other, that's when affordability issues really present themselves. But ultimately, what underlies this and the argument we're going to make today through a very fun, hopefully fun analogy, trope of clue, is that underlying all this is a scarcity of homes and a mismatch between the number of people who want homes in a given community and the number of homes that are either there or being added over time.
Yeah, and one more little stat that's not on that slide is just for comparison's sake. Rents, you can see, went up 60% in New Mexico in that time period, and in that same time period nationally, they went up 27%. So it's more than double.
And same with homelessness in New Mexico. Mm-hmm. Our increases in homelessness over the last 8 years are roughly double what the average is nationally. And so these things tie together. Yeah. When affordability is that much worse, these ancillary problems are also that much worse.
And they are geographically concentrated as well. So once upon a time, 26-year-olds could buy a house. And that particular 26-year-old is me, in front of my brand new house in Santa Fe, expecting our first baby. And we bought that house, which was a 1977 house, for $140,000. It was a stretch. We didn't have an inheritance. We didn't have parents who loaned us money. It was a stretch, but we could do it. And as a 26-year-old, I could afford to start a family in 1997. That same house in Santa Fe is now worth $512,000. I just checked last night. So it has had a giant increase, and even controlling for inflation, that's a 75% jump in cost. So it's way outrun inflation, the cost of housing. So when we talk about the lack of affordability, that's really what we're talking about. And as a result, today's median first-time buyer in the US is now 40 years old. And in 1991, she was similar to me, she was 28. And you also bought your house.
We figured out, I also bought my first home at 26. I was a home buyer counselor helping people buy their first homes. And the first thing people ask you is, you look kind of young. Do you own a home? And I was able to buy a home in 2003 in Santa Fe for $185,000, right? And now I would say that entry-level home price on the market in Santa Fe is about $450,000. And so I think we can all imagine that even with inflation and all these other factors, wages have not gone up that much, right? And so that opportunity is sort of lost for the 26-year-olds of today.
Yeah. So we have suspects, and I mapped them onto 4 of the 6 clue characters because we only have so much time. So we have, and I'd like a show of hands for who thinks each of these suspects is the bad guy. You can raise your hand more than once if you want. So first we have Mr. Green, and we're going to make him the greedy developer. And then we have, so any show of hands, who thinks the developers are the problem? You can just quietly nod if you...
No shame, too.
No shame, yeah.
Safe space.
Yes, exactly. And then who thinks that Airbnbs, Miss Scarlett is the Airbnb host? How many of you have heard, or even just heard, how many of you have heard that housing is now unaffordable because short-term rentals have taken up all of the housing costs? Yeah. And then we have Professor Plum. who is the corporate landlord. A lot more hands on that one, yeah. That's a very common villain for who's caused the housing crisis. And our final suspect is Mrs. Peacock, the protective homeowner. Okay, a couple more hands there. All right, so hold. Oh yeah, does anyone want to throw out like a final? We're going to go through these 4, but if anyone has like another villain in their mind, I just want to hear it.
Are we talking locally or the next?
Maybe both, but let's say locally. Who do you think's the villain? You gonna say Lannel? Because I hear that one a lot too. Okay, so keeping these suspects in mind, let's go through them one by one. Whoops.
It's Amy.
It's specifically? I'm so glad we know who it is. Okay, we're going to start off with Mr. Green.
Let me take this one. Having been a developer of affordable housing, I can stand in on this one really well. So here's Mr. Green, the greedy developer. He's standing there on what used to be the vacant piece of land where you like to walk your dog with a smoking gun next to some $800,000 new houses. And he looks really guilty. Whether it's new apartments or expensive new housing, the developer is in many ways the face of housing unaffordability. They oftentimes can be gruff, and they have to fight their way through all these challenging processes to get housing built. But a lot of our understanding of developers comes from another time, right? When people made a lot of money from housing development. And what it turns out in reality is that building housing is like one of the hardest things we can do, right? I was just joking about this, maybe short of some of the things that happen over here. It's, and if you think about it, we actually treat new housing not unlike stuff that's almost as unsafe as some of the things that happen here, right? Like, oh my God, new housing's dangerous. We've got to really control this with regulations, and we're worried about cars and traffic. Well, in the end, I think the example that always sits with me is that developers are no more profit motivated than any other segment of our society, right? They're no more greedy than a grocery store or Toyota, and they are providing this essential service that we need, which is housing. And believe it or not, almost every house that someone lives in today, maybe even your house, was built by one of these developers at one point. We just forget that happened in the past, right? But that ultimately, using, say, the example of Toyota builds a $120,000 SUV, and it builds a $28,000 Camry. What do you think makes it more money as a company? Camrys, because they sell a lot of them, right? And housing is just like this, and that ultimately it is the regulatory frameworks, the demand frameworks, the financing frameworks that dictate what developers build. If you make it easier to build more affordable housing, the market will go there. And so ultimately, the developer, while often the face of expensive new housing, and largely because the newest housing is the most expensive to build, right? It's the most expensive housing we've ever built. If you start a house today, it will be the most expensive to build housing that has ever been created. And so there's a disconnect there that oftentimes we say, oh, they're building new housing. That should be affordable. That should be for solving this problem. But it's not the way the economics of this works.
And it's like 1% of all housing stock is brand new, or less than 1%
right.
too. Yeah.
So, especially in the case of apartments, right? And so this is a great example of a concept called filtering. So when you don't build new housing, the demand for housing is very high relative to the amount of housing available. So like in Santa Fe, where it didn't build new rental housing for about 10 years, graded apartments, Class A, are brand new, nicest amenities. Class B are like solid. Class C are considered, kind of affordable, naturally affordable apartments. Well, Class C apartments in Santa Fe were renting for Class A prices until they started building new housing. And what happens when you build that new housing is it actually lowers the price of less desirable older housing, right? So this is a counterintuitive thing, particularly with apartments. Unlike home ownership, apartments don't necessarily go up and up and up in value like an owned home will. If you're building new housing, older housing becomes less desirable and becomes more affordable. But if you don't build that new housing, that older housing stock can still command the same prices because the demand is still the same. And all you have is people at higher incomes choosing to live in lower quality housing because it's all that's available. This ultimately trickles down and affects the lowest income people, right? Because they end up getting priced out. So this is an example of a Pew study where the building of high-end new apartments and how it led to actual decreases in rents for lower cost apartments not even related to it. So one of the big examples here is just thinking about divorcing the act of building new housing from having to be the very thing that solves the problem, right? Because the people with the incomes to afford higher cost housing are going to be there and they're going to pay for that housing. And so in some cases, providing housing that is at their price point can have decreased pressure on lower end parts of the market.
Yeah, it's not like if you make housing an auction, the wealthiest people are going to win that auction, right? So we've exonerated Mr. Green, and now we're on to suspect number 2, who is Miss Scarlett, the Airbnb host. And she's got a little bit more of blood on her hands. There's some more evidence against her. We find her like crouching over the body, like going through the pockets, looking a little suspicious. And it turns out, the way to think about, that people think about this is that Airbnbs are taking long-term rentals and they're turning them into short-term rentals, which makes a ton of sense for a landlord in a tight market, like especially in Santa Fe. You're just going to make a lot more money, on a short-term rental than a long-term rental. So the incentives are all lined up there. And as it turns out, when you study this across the country, so in the aggregate, they really are taking some of these houses off the long-term rental market. And it's about you can assign about 20% of all rent increases to this effect, this Airbnb effect. So if you're shopping around for a place to rent, or you're renting and your rent goes up by about $100, you can ascribe about $20 of that to Airbnb into short-term rentals. But housing was already becoming quite unaffordable before Airbnb showed up in 2008, and they didn't really kind of even get going until 2013, and we were already, taken off by then. So do you have anything to add on Airbnb?
Yeah, I would just add a couple things. One, just as a question, would Airbnb be an issue if we had enough housing, right? It's a problem that's created by scarcity. In 2 ways. One, because we don't have enough of the type of housing we need. So when you remove housing from the market, it exacerbates affordability. 2, we often try and solve that by regulating the number of Airbnbs there are, right? But that is actually creates a perverse incentive because it then makes the small number of Airbnbs very valuable and lucrative for people, right? And so it has this bad knock-on effect of incentivizing people to try and get this scarce opportunity. And it makes some people winners and some people losers. You get a short-term rental permit, you're a winner. Lots of people don't have that option. And right, if we think about having equality amongst property owners, that's not a really fair way of doing things, right? And so I always try and think that, a better environment is an environment where we have enough housing, where we don't have to regulate what people can do with their properties, right? Yeah. The kind of abundance where people have choices to do with their properties as they wish.
It makes the incentives line up a lot better. So now we have Professor Plum, the corporate landlord.
Corporate landlord was a popular, this is a popular suspect. The idea of some slumlord rent fixing and meddling with prices and using AI algorithms to gouge people. But this is a lot like our Airbnb scenario, right? The ability to gouge people really only comes from scarcity. The lack of supply means that people can charge whatever they want. The reality is that a modest apartment complex nowadays of, say, 60 housing units costs north of $20 million to build, right? And so the idea that we're going to have a mom and pop owner of an apartment complex that size is really outdated, right? The idea, almost all of rental housing at scale is owned by some form of corporation. When we go out into the wider market of existing housing, it actually turns out that this isn't a very big segment of our market, particularly here in New Mexico. And while we hear stories, after 2008, Blackstone is buying up properties, and this is true in certain markets. If you're in Cleveland, if you're in Chattanooga, yes, corporations have bought a lot of housing. You can buy a house there for $80,000 and turn around and rent it for $800 a month, and that makes sense. In New Mexico, where the median new home is $450,000 or $500,000, that corporate model of ownership doesn't work, right? And so what we find is that the stats are much, much lower. Nationally, it's about 3% of housing is owned by corporations, right?
Of rental housing.
Of rental housing, right?
Or even single-family rental housing. It's even a smaller amount.
And so while it seems like a big problem, and it makes sense intuitively, not backed by statistics in New Mexico, even in our largest city, Albuquerque, 6 to 7% of rental housing is corporately owned. And the vast majority of that are small mom and pop operators who own under 5 units of housing. And so the idea that I think corporations are doing a lot of not so great stuff in the world. And so it's easy to think that this just carries across. But again, a more beneficiary of the scarcity of housing than a driver of the underlying unaffordability.
That's right. And in Los Alamos, we have, like all of us probably know somebody who's renting out a room, and we have a lot of mom and pop landlords and virtually no corporate landlords in Los Alamos, and we don't have Airbnb either, and we still have a huge unaffordability problem, so that kind of puts a dent in that suspect. So now we have exonerated or cleared, for the most part, our 4, so we have 1 left, therefore we have the murderer. And this is, spoiler, this is Mrs. Peacock, the protective homeowner. But wait, we like Mrs. Peacock. She's such an involved citizen. She shows up to all of the county council meetings.
First name basis with all the commissioners, yeah.
So what's her motivation? And it turns out her motivation is to stop change and also to keep her housing costs high. For example, think about that house that I bought in 1997 and what it's worth now, and also the house in Los Alamos that we bought in 2015 has doubled in value. So when people look at that, they're like, I like this scarcity. This is really working out well for me. I'm going to make sure that there's no... So on both fronts, on both I don't want my neighborhood character to change, and I really like my house turning into a stock market, there's a lot of incentives for Mrs. Peacock. And he pointed out that, Mrs. Peacock is a woman, so this seems kind of sexist. And they've actually done, he was like, I'm not doing this slide. And it turns out they've actually done studies on who shows up to fight housing at this level, and it is actually more men than women. So Mrs. Peacock is actually typically an older homeowner who is generally white and generally male. So I'm sure we're all shocked.
And I would step out a level with this. It's hard to ascribe a character to the larger framework of what we're talking about here. But this is really a system of outdated land use and zoning frameworks that impose sort of older ideas of housing on younger generations, right? Every house should be on 1/5 an acre and et cetera. And it's also about outdated frameworks, right? Like a lot of the zoning and land use code frameworks were designed in the 60s and 70s on models created right after World War II, so suburban sort of sprawl development. And they're not considering things like climate change and all these other things. And what underlies this is a really fundamental thing. There's only so many levers we can pull to make housing more affordable. And one of the biggest ones is density, the amount of housing that you allow on a given piece of land. And so, we can't lower the cost of 2x4s realistically. We can't lower the cost of labor in a scarce labor environment. So what can we affect, right? We can affect the number of houses you can put on a piece of land. And this is an important thing to understand because it ties back to our greedy developer. When he arrives at a piece of land and you tell him, this acre of land can have one house, his mind goes, I need to build the biggest, most expensive house possible to maximize profit. Now, if you said you can build up to 10 houses on this same piece of land, the profit motive then becomes to build the most number of houses, the profit motive, and you naturally create smaller, more affordable homes. More than that, all the fixed costs of that development, right? The land, the infrastructure, the street light the county made you put in down the road, all those costs, if they all go into one house, they're very high. If they go into 10 houses, they're split 10 ways. Same with the land costs, same with the architecture fees, same with all this stuff. And so it's one of the greatest ways. You could take a $100,000 land cost for a home and lower it to $10,000, right? Right there, you've saved $90,000 per housing unit on the hard cost to develop a piece of land. So these are one of the big things we think about, density, and it's one of the biggest objections, right? That's what you'll hear all the time. It's not safe, it's gonna cause traffic, you're stacking people on top of each other like tenements, when in reality, a lot of people want housing that's like that. A lot of people don't want to take care of yards, right? A lot of people don't have that choice. Maybe you're getting older and you have a 4-bedroom house and there's no other options, right? And maybe a 1-bedroom, universally designed, handicap accessible unit would fit better, right? But you can't build that under the zoning because no one's going to build you an 800 square foot accessible unit on a 1 acre lot, right? It doesn't make financial sense, right?
Yeah.
And so this is how inadvertently a lot of our regulatory frameworks, which are propped up by a system that gives Mrs. Peacock an outsized voice, not a democratic voice, but a hyper powerful voice in these processes, leads to the preservation of these types of regulatory systems that no longer meet our needs and don't actually incentivize the market to solve the problems we need to solve around affordability.
That's right. And I don't think I didn't know this before I became a planning commissioner, but how little land really in Los Alamos has allowed any kind of house other than the giant house on the most expensive kind, the giant house on the single family large lot. So before our 2022 code rewrite, only, if you look at the 2010 Affordable Housing Plan, only 5% of all of the residential land in Los Alamos allowed more than 9 units per acre. And they called that high density in that plan, and that is not high density housing in any other world, but that was considered high density in that plan. So we have found our murderer, and now we need to go through exactly, Daniel already talked about some of this, but how the murder happened. And I'm going to set the stage and then hand it over to you. What you don't see on here is that zoning actually is about 100 years old. So in 1926, exactly 100 years ago, the Supreme Court blessed zoning. Before that, it was not clear that it was constitutional, because you're telling...
They shot it down because the first time they said, we only want people of color in this neighborhood, and we only want white people in this neighborhood. And the Supreme Court said, no, you can't do that. And then they came back and said, what if we only allow apartments in this neighborhood and only allow houses with really big lots over here? And they're like, yeah, that's fine. There's a similarity there, right? Actually, the underlying part of zoning is a racial motivation. It was literally the original case. It's literally, the case was based on like, the other side of the tracks is where this can happen, and this side of the tracks was where this can happen.
Yeah, but
Ohio, Euclid, Ohio.
You guys probably heard of redlining. Well, almost all R1 districts in a lot of cities, which means 1 unit per, large lot, they're all the redlined districts. So it's like, it's got some pretty,
racial history.
Racial history. But housing did not become unaffordable immediately in 1926. It became unaffordable much more recently. So then we have to explain why that is. And really, we had in the middle of the 20th century, like a build, baby, build kind of ethos. There was a lot of construction happening. And then in the 1970s, the whole American vibe was like, no, we don't like that anymore. Like, we want to shut the whole thing down, build bad. And so that's when all this really restrictive zoning kicked in with the big parking mandates, the lot minimums, the height caps, to really squash growth outward. And we could get away with that for a while because we had greenfield development. You want to talk about that, especially in Santa Fe? They still have some. We don't have any.
Right. And that's where you say, oh, it's hard to build in the urban core of the city. Maybe Mrs. Peacock shows up and yells at us. Well, we'll just go out to the edge and we'll start building out there. And in Santa Fe, this is still happening. It's a terrible growth pattern for a bunch of reasons, mainly because at the density we're building housing, it doesn't generate enough tax revenue to pay for maintaining its infrastructure over time, right? We're creating these ticking time bombs by extending public infrastructure, and the developers build it, and then we own it, and we have to pay for it and fix it over time. But there's another factor that I would add in here that is the 2008 housing crisis. Now, I've been working in housing for 23 years, right? I've been through 3 major housing crises events. First was the run-up to the mortgage meltdown, which created a huge price cap. Then the actual mortgage crisis, that's one of the main drivers of why we're having housing affordability problems. And the way that I would think about this, to help you guys understand, so if you look at the 15 years before the 2009 financial crisis and the 15 years since, the last 15 years we've built about half the housing on average than we did for the 15 years preceding that. And so we have a 15-year, 50% underproduction of housing that exists right now. It's very hard to catch up on that type of housing because there's only so much infrastructure. One of the biggest things that happened was we lost numerous tradespeople in 2009. We lost developers. People were like, I was a journeyman plumber and now I'm a nurse, literally. And so you can't just replace those people, right? It takes 4 or 5 years for a journeyman to become a licensed plumber or electrician, right? And so we have these really structural shortages, and everyone's trying to build housing at the same time. And what that does is it drives those labor costs up really high. There's these bigger structural issues that relate to the things that have happened over the last 20 years, but the lack of labor, and now the construction cost and interest rate environment. So this is a little math. If you've got one of those really lovely 3% mortgages that were so prevalent in the last 15 years, take the current $450,000 entry-level house in Santa Fe at a 7% interest rate. Once you load in all your taxes, that's a $4,000 a month mortgage, right? And so that is just pricing out about 85% of even the existing residents in Santa Fe County. Most of them would not be able to move back to Santa Fe if they had to buy their house again. And I think that's probably the same for a lot of folks here as well. So it's a lot of factors that have led to where we are. But one of the only ways we're going to get out of this is figuring out ways to build newer houses that are less costly and to provide more housing choice.
Right. And real quick, we're just going to talk about, just for as an example, Texas, which has the same state, same lumber prices, same interest rates, same, missing journeymen and all that. But they have different rules. They have different land use rules, and they've had wildly different outcomes because of that. So Dallas has kept its enormous lot minimums at 7,500 square feet. Houston legalized minimum lot sizes of 1,400 square feet, saw an enormous boom in townhomes, and rents didn't go down there, but they stabilized, whereas they went up quite a bit in Dallas. And homelessness, not just because of this, but homelessness fell in Houston while rising in Dallas. Also, Houston has a much better evidence-based homelessness program, which we don't have time to talk about right now, but we can get back to it in the Q&A. So now we're on to, now that we know how the murder happened, that kind of makes the solution somewhat obvious. We need to unwind all of those rules that we built in to push the housing out to the edge of the greenfield. As a developer, what would you say are the rules that really make the biggest difference?
Density, parking requirements. I think one of the legacies of that sprawl mentality is that we dump hundreds of millions of dollars into subsidizing transportation networks. So most of the new employees at the lab can live in greenfield developments in Santa Fe, right? We're all subsidizing this. And when I go to build affordable housing for very low income people, I'm mandated to subsidize the auto industry by providing free parking, right? I have to do that. In Santa Fe, the parking for a 2-bedroom apartment actually takes up more physical space than the apartment. Right? We're dedicating a lot of land and resource to cars. So that's a big one. I think making processes more predictable, right? We accept it as natural that we bring big projects in front of city councils for approval, but if I told you, I want you to go do this really hard thing that has 6 or 7 major stakeholders, financial people, contractors, investors, I want you to spend hundreds of thousands of dollars before you have any right to do this thing. And then the final decision about why you get to do it or not, we're just going to toss it to 4, 5, 6, 7, 8 random politicians who may or may not understand housing technical planning issues, infrastructure issues, right? It's actually kind of absurd. And so one of the biggest things we should do is move to really robust planning processes to come to community agreement about what is okay and not okay to build, and then create performative standards that projects either meet or don't meet, rather than taking it to a political level. It's really the only way to get around the outsized influence that Mrs. Peacock has on the process.
And it would have been great if we could have done this 20 years ago in Los Alamos in particular, back when it was much cheaper to build. Construction costs weren't 40% higher than they were in 2021. Like, it would have been really good if we had had the political will to do this when it was much easier. But since we can't time travel, the next best time is now. So here's all of the things that Daniel just said are things we can do in Los Alamos to help affordability. And critically, right now, we're rewriting our comprehensive plan, and the zoning code that goes with it is being tweaked. So we can do all of those things. What?
Does everyone know what a comprehensive plan is?
Oh, yeah, good point.
Anybody know what a Sophia, you don't count.
Sophia, you're not allowed to answer that question. Do you want to say
any
really
current or former planning stuff? Don't get that interest. So a comprehensive plan is a big strategic document that's done through community outreach, and they're usually done hopefully every about 5 years, sometimes more like 10, or if you're Santa Fe, 30. And it's where you say these are our community values around growth, development, housing. And they're big, lofty things, like we want people of all incomes to be able to live here. We want high levels of energy efficiency and environmental responsibility with the housing we build.
We want to protect open space.
We want to protect open space. We want walkable neighborhoods. These are the kind of types of values. And then you create strategies under those, how to achieve those things. And then in the best case process, you then move on to your zoning code and your land use frameworks. And that's where you put those ideals into function, right? And so the comprehensive plan is the top level strategic document that shapes the growth of a community, often for 5, 10, 20, in case of Santa Fe, 25 years. Their comprehensive plan is from 1999, right? And that's what they're still running on. So one of the things that's really helpful by having a robust comprehensive planning process is a lot of times what I've seen in being in hundreds of land use approval meetings over the years is that we're not really arguing about that housing project. A lot of times we're arguing about community values, and we're trying to adjudicate community values in the only venue we have, right? And it's actually a really disingenuous process, right? Because you can't fix those community value issues in a land use project. Maybe, elected leaders will try and fix a thing here. We'll lower the density a little bit. We'll add another entrance over here that doesn't go by that neighborhood, right? All those things add cost to the housing. And they actually don't make people feel better, whose real issue is just they feel like maybe the community's changing in ways they don't have input in, or that they haven't been heard. So robust comprehensive planning processes are about creating venues for those conversations and hopefully coming to agreement as a community. Is like, maybe we should let people build a couple guest houses in their backyards instead of sprawling out on the edge of the city.
Maybe we should let people convert a home into a duplex or subdivide their 2-acre lot. Yeah.
Right. So a lot of these things aren't just big new developments, right? For a community like Los Alamos, you've got some considerable constraints, like the whatever giant hole in the ground is next to us here. But you could look at general density approaches, right? Letting people add a guest house or two, letting someone build a 4-unit. Minneapolis, that was on the slide before, right? They've been really successful at lowering rents. One of the biggest things they did is they said, up to a 4-unit property is legal on every lot in our city. And it allowed people to build small-scale multi-unit housing that often isn't owned by big corporations, because it wasn't $20 million to build. It was $600,000 to build, right? So a lot of that is about finding solutions. There's no universal solutions. Every community is different. If we had universal solutions, we would have done it, right? We would have done it a long time ago. You got to try a lot of different strategies. You got to do things that add housing at every different price point.
We also have to be on the same page with the evidence about what it is that works, right?
Yeah.
Yeah, like if we have ideas in our head about how housing gets more affordable that are wildly out of touch with reality.
Right. It's not 3D printing. I hate to break it to you guys. We're not going to 3D print houses our way out of this.
Yeah. So, I think about that 26-year-old, and now my kids are about of an average age of 26 if you add them together. And they're renters, and they're not going to be able to buy a house. They're going to be renters unless we buy a house for them, right? And that's so true for the next couple of generations. And if we call ourselves humanists, if we really care about fairness and affordability, the good news is we don't have to rely on the federal government, because that's really unlikely to come through for us anytime in the near future. But we actually have the power ourselves in our communities to make housing affordability real again. So I think that's a good place for us to wrap it up. And unless you want to add anything?
I would just say new housing isn't a bad thing.
Yeah.
Right? We treat it like a bad thing. We treat it like it's dangerous. We treat it like it's a negative impact to community. And it isn't. It's an essential part of a thriving community. And things like new neighbors are great. Mm-hmm. It's like if you love your neighborhood, why not share it with some new people?
Mm-hmm. Yeah, that's a great place to wrap it up.
Well, thank you both very much. I think we have time to entertain some questions.
Yes.
Sure.
Okay, so everybody raise your hand and I'll bring the microphone. Remember, keep it close to your mouth or else we're not going to hear you. So about an inch or two. Okay? Okay, Amy?
I'm going to ask my question, then I'm going to tell you why I'm asking it, and then I'm going to ask it again.
Oh.
Interesting.
Because I'm a long-winded person, so you're going to get lost. I'm curious, this is the question, how you think we change the cultural values so that people are comfortable with those new neighbors. Now, here's why I asked the question. My background is in folklore, anthropology, and history, and in 2003 to 2008, I lived in Portland, Oregon. Now, Portland, Oregon at that point had established a growth boundary around the city. They were trying to do exactly what you're talking about, which is infill. Mm-hmm. So there were neighborhoods with those, a fifth of an acre houses, and they were trying to build more apartments and that kind of thing. At that time, I was a renter. I lived in a house with 4 other people because it was the only way you could do it. We would walk around the neighborhood and watch the housing prices go up and up and up and up and up and up and up. It was crazy. And I also was doing a cultural history report for TriMet, which is the public transit authority. And I was doing it in outer southeast Portland. And outer southeast Portland at that time had historically been these larger areas, larger houses. It was definitely kind of growth during the 50s kind of out to the suburbs. And they were working on doing some of this infill. It was a place where refugees and immigrants and also longtime immigrants, including the Chinese community that had lived in downtown, were kind of going out to that area, right? Mm-hmm. So there was all the recipes for racism, and there was all the recipes for not in my neighborhood, not in my backyard kind of behavior. It was a very politically purple area at the time. It was really interesting to run around and talk to people in barbershops and houses and schools and things like that. So I'd be talking to lots of different folks because I was writing a report so they could build light rail through that neighborhood and so they could put art on the light rail that actually represented the neighborhoods. And what I learned from that is exactly what you guys are talking about. The people who had grown up in those big old houses and rolled around in the backyard with their friends and neighbors didn't want new folks coming in and dividing things up. And the immigrants and refugees were like, there's a point where we can't get to our jobs if you keep pushing us to the boundary. Yeah. So here's the question again. How do we do an emotional, cultural shift to people so that their default isn't racism and isn't ageism and isn't not in my backyard? Because to me, that has to go along with changes in laws.
I have a quick answer to that, and then maybe Daniel will have an answer as well. I find that the thing that helps to change minds and change cultures is to focus on values. Everybody has some kind of shared values. No matter who they are, there is some value that you share with them. If you can find that value that you share, you can have a different conversation about what it is you want your community to look like. And that's where I would start, is finding that, on an individual level, finding those shared values and starting from that.
Yeah, and it's a great question. It really lights up my anthropology degree. I've approached a lot of this work from an anthropological lens, right? I think a lot of the pushback to growth and development is an attempt to control change, right? The world's changing really fast around us, especially the last 8 years. And sometimes that's the only thing you can control, right? And I think I think better public planning processes are really a big part of that, and getting people in the room together. Some of the neat stuff that's been done in some communities for these planning processes, rather than saying, hey, everyone come to this meeting and give us input on our comprehensive plan, we promise you stale croissants from Smith's. You actually create committees of people who are actually diverse and representative. And you pay them to participate in these processes, and you ensure that the people who are making these decisions represent renters and immigrants and all kinds of different people in the community. And that's led to planning structures that are much better. The other thing that I would say is less so true now about Portland, but especially early on, there is, and this is true in a lot of places, we concentrate growth in certain areas, right? Because we exclude other areas. We call it exclusionary zoning, low density zoning, historic overlays, multi-step public approval processes to do things. Those all exclude new things. And then a lot of times what that does is it makes certain areas bear the brunt of all the growth, right? Like Santa Fe is a great example. Look at the South Side in Santa Fe. Look at the demographics, look at the number of new housing units, right? We've concentrated families, lower income people into this one area because we've made it impossible to build in the other areas. And then all these other knock-on effects happen. There's this, they're saying now, don't build any more affordable housing in our neighborhood. We've built all the affordable housing, right? So even then there's a backlash, and our schools are overcrowded on that side because housing affordability ties so closely to having school-age children. And so I think it's sort of a principle of no neighborhood should have to take the entire brunt of solving a housing crisis, but no neighborhood should be able to exempt itself either, right? And so that's an important part of it.
Real quick, Espanola has absorbed a lot of our the housing that we haven't built, and their housing prices have gone up precipitously, and that has displaced a lot of people there too and caused a lot of homelessness problems that people here don't understand how direct that impact is. So that's another example of pushing the development somewhere else that's not in your backyard.
And then ultimately, I do think it just comes down to more community education about this stuff. We're running on the fumes of 80s tropes of Milagro Beanfield Ward developers coming in, right? And it's we've got to just get grounded in the fact that if we're going to create social justice, economic justice, environmental justice, it's not a thing we're going to protest our way to when it comes to housing. It has to be built, it has to be proactive. And so the question is, these things are going to happen. Growth and change are going to happen in communities. Look at Santa Fe. We didn't build apartments forever, and now what have we done? We've made it so it's economically viable to build 300-unit apartment complexes on commercial land. And we've built a ton of them, and great, rents are dropping finally, which is crazy to think that that could ever happen, but it's not happening the way we wanted it to. It's not happening in a way that anyone's happy about. And so I think one of the big things to get across is like growth and change are inevitable. And what we need to find are the paths to growth that feel good, that are intentional and not driven by lowest common denominator, sort of the market will find a way, like water finds the lowest spot.
Yeah, that's a great answer.
Okay, thank you. Another question?
So this is sort of personal interest. I've heard that Austin, Texas has been successful in increasing the housing stock and thereby decreasing rents. And I used to live there, but I don't know whether they did that by infill or greenfield. Do you have any idea?
It's both, but I think most of all it's been really aggressive measures around land use and zoning. The minimum lot size in Austin now is 1,500 square feet. So if you can imagine, the size of an entry-level house is your lot. And they're building these really interesting houses, sometimes 2 and 3 stories, 600 or 800 square foot footprint. And 600 footprint and then multiple stories, so you can still have a. It is. It applies to the whole place, and so I think this ties back to the other question. I think the thing that you have to remember too is when you do these types of regulatory changes, you also have to still invest in housing affordability, because right, like just having lots of houses doesn't make it affordable to the lowest income people. I think the other thing you have to do is actually help make sure that you don't disrupt existing neighborhoods. Because all of a sudden, say you have a 6,000 square foot lot and they say, oh, this can be 4 housing units now. That can be really disruptive where people are doing things speculatively. So one of the things that I always talk about is you kind of have a holistic approach that protects existing tenants, especially lower income folks in neighborhoods that are going to get will face a lot of redevelopment pressure. And then also doing proactive investments in affordable housing in those neighborhoods that may see growth and development change. It really has to be a 3-legged stool to get out of the kind of thing you're talking about. But yeah, Austin is mixed. They're also growing at the urban fringe. They do it a lot better than we do in New Mexico because of the way their utilities work and the way that infrastructure is extended. But a lot of it's been in the urban core of the city. A lot of people are pissed off. Home prices are down about 15% in Austin. And so if you bought at the peak, which was absurd, let's just say this, like for all the people who are like, the chance that you're actually going to build enough housing to where people's home values go down is unlikely in best case scenarios. We're just trying to hold growth to single digit numbers per year because we've seen double digits for the last 5-6 years. So I think the answer is it's both in Austin. There is a lot of infill development there. And I've worked in Austin. I've gone there fairly regularly over the last decade. And just sometimes you're like, whoa, the pace of change is unreal. Same with Houston. But if we think about what cities really should be, they should grow and change, right? And
the
neighborhoods,
city,
right?
Yeah.
And the neighborhoods that used to be suburban fringe. I mean, Santa Fe is a great example. The urban core of Santa Fe is around Seiler Yard. It used to be where the waste treatment plant and all the industrial stuff was. And now that's the middle of the city. And we can't keep treating it like it's the edge of the town when it's the middle of the city, right? You've got to change how you think about that stuff.
So good job, first of all.
Thank you.
So we live in a region that's upside down in needs of housing. Is there a reason or is there a push at a state level to really appreciate what you just said? In other words, how do we catch up from the 10,000 housing units we're upside down in this very small region of less than 500,000 people? And what is going to drive that? Because without housing, you have no economic development. Nobody's going to come here, and everybody's going to get out as quick as possible until we fix that. And that just seems like a state level or a Secretary of Economic Development level. How do you do that? because most regions you've talked about, those were organic growth. They had the capacity to do several thousand housing units to meet a corporate relocation or whatever. So you can be king and queen for the day and answer this.
I'm the housing benevolent dictator.
Exactly. Well, Montana, at a state level, put some guardrails around zoning to stop cities from being so exclusionary. They're largest. So that's an example of a state that had a bipartisan state-level zoning reform package that worked. We tried it this year. The legislator, there's a couple of like really great legislators who really tried to get some state-level zoning reform done. It was a pretty big failure.
Well, and here's what I say, having spent a couple years in state-level government, in the governor's office, trying to address this stuff, coming from the very perspective that you have, that like the fact that hiring at the labs creates a demand for 300 houses a year in Santa Fe, and that's all we're building, that starts to look like a regional issue. That starts to not be a local issue, right? And that's really where that's a state's purview, right? And we have communities that have very high demand for housing that aren't adding housing, that are creating problems in other communities, right? And so that to me was one of the main reasons why I felt the state needed to get involved in housing. The state does not have a housing agency, right? And it hasn't since the late 1980s. There was a corruption scandal. They disbanded the housing office at the state. They moved all the housing functions to a quasi-governmental organization, a housing finance agency, which is a lot like a bank. Right? So we're very good at our financing programs. We're very good at funding below market rate affordable housing for the money we have. We've dumped about $500 million into housing in the last 3 legislative sessions. Try and get your head around that. It's not being felt, right? Largely because the issues are systemic. They lie with how we tax construction and housing. A lot of people probably don't know this, but we charge sales tax on the entire construction of a house in New Mexico, and that's unusual. Usually you see either materials or labor but not both, right? That entry-level house, that's $40,000 just in taxes, right? And when the cost of building a house doubles in 5 years, so does the tax on that housing, right? So that's an example of where a state could intervene. These regulatory frameworks between communities, like, it's like, one community can say, we're going to make it legal to build on smaller lots, and the other community says no. Well, who adjudicates between those? Or a community says, we don't want to build affordable housing here, but they have a need for affordable housing, and sometimes state-level planning can work really well to do that. The other thing that we found is that local governments just are fundamentally unable to make the right decisions around housing because of the dynamics we talked about of the Mrs. Peacock scenario, right? Local government politicians are very accountable to the loudest voices in the room, to the people who show up at meetings. But those 20 people that are there to stop a project in Santa Fe are counterbalanced by 85,000 people that chose not to show up because they don't care. But yet we're listening to that small group of people. So many states now, every state around us has enacted some level of state housing zoning reform that says, the authority we've delegated to local governments to manage zoning, that's a delegated authority from the state, we're going to actually selectively take back some of these things that don't say they're working. Great example would be like Washington State said that for a house under 1,600 square feet, you can't mandate more than 1 parking space. And what that's saying is that you can have more parking if a developer wants to do it, if they think that's marketable, but you can't mandate that they have 3 parking spaces on that house, which is how things work right now. That naturally shrinks lots, that gets more houses in, it lowers cost. A parking stall costs $25,000 now, right? So it's like these types of things where the state can do sort of acupuncture-like interventions. Maybe it's saying, some people are talking about state-level minimum lot sizes, right? Things like that. So I think there are a role for the state. It's a big lift for New Mexico because we don't have housing expertise at the state level right now. And unfortunately, every one of the 17 departments of our state government are doing housing, however. And that's one of the big issues in New Mexico. And the money we're giving away for housing is very much like, well, we like that project. We like this project. This project's in this district. And none of it is based on need, outcome, these types of things. We're sort of just spreading money around without any strategy. And so just allowing some sort of level of strategy at state government, strategy in how we're giving out money, maybe saying that, like Santa Fe, your regulatory process is adding $80,000 to cost of a home, the time it takes to develop it, the extra infrastructure requirements. Is it the state's job to subsidize that? The same that they would subsidize a house in a community that, like Las Cruces, who makes it very easy to build housing? We're spending public money to offset the cost of broken regulatory systems. That's not right, right? And so these are the type of things that we think about in terms of state level interventions. There is always talk of trying to create a housing office, whether it be a department or a subdivision or an executive office. I got really close. I got it through all the way to the last committee, and then all it took was one committee chairman to be like, I don't feel like putting that on an agenda, and it died, right? And it passed the House with overwhelming majorities, right? So we have some issues with the way our political system works in New Mexico that have kept us from doing some of these state-level interventions. And frankly, the HFA, the Mortgage Finance Authority, now Housing New Mexico, they're territorial. They don't want to see anyone else in the housing business at the state level. And so they've actively worked to stop that creation. So we've got some big things to overcome, but we also have this completely untapped solution that every state around us has employed, and every one of those states is doing markedly better at housing than us.
Yep.
Any other questions? Well, I'd like to thank you very much. You've actually catalyzed a lot of more questions in my mind, so if you're going to be available afterwards, maybe we can give you some questions.
Sure.
Okay?
Sure thing.
Thank you
Yeah.
very much.
And thank you.
Thank you, everyone.